You know, when we try to understand a major historical event, we usually expect a certain level of clinical precision.
Right, like a clean timeline.
Exactly. We want the timeline to look like a clean X-ray. You break an arm, the doctor holds up the film, points to that jagged white line and says, there's the fracture. That's where it all went wrong.
Yeah, we want to be able to point to a date on a calendar and say, this single decision right here is exactly why the tragedy happened.
Right, because it's incredibly comforting to think of history that way.
Oh, absolutely. We naturally crave that binary cause and effect relationship. It allows us to, neatly categorize events, file them away, and feel like we actually have a grip on how the world operates.
But the reality is, when you step into the world of geopolitical conflict, covert intelligence, and state-sponsored assassination.
That X-ray machine is completely useless.
Completely useless. The image you get back isn't a clean fracture. It's this shadowy, overlapping mess of old wounds, systemic diseases, and absolute diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah.
And, well, welcome to this deep dive. We are thrilled to have you with us today, listening in.
We really are.
I want you to picture a scene. The date is May 21st, 1991. The time is exactly 10:20 p.m. We are in a small, dusty industrial town called Sriperumbudur.
Which is located in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu.
Right. And it's night, but the area is completely washed out by the harsh glare of floodlights. There was this massive, chaotic political rally in full swing.
Just a sea of people.
Yeah, the crowds are surging forward, eager to get a glimpse of a political titan who's trying to make his comeback. And in the middle of this crush of humanity, a young woman wearing a bulky vest under her clothes approaches the center of the crowd.
She bends down.
She bends down. And in a blinding, concussive flash of light, the trajectory of South Asian history is violently and permanently altered.
Yeah, that bomb claimed the life of Rajiv Gandhi, the former Prime Minister of India, along with 15 other people who, simply had the terrible misfortune of standing nearby.
Just innocent bystanders.
Exactly. But the shockwave of that RDX explosive didn't just rip through the crowd that night. It rippled backward through decades of proxy wars, and it rippled forward into a 30-year legal and political labyrinth that, frankly, India is still untangling today.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. You've shared a massive stack of sources with us, and we're going to trace the entire tangled web of this assassination.
It's a heavy stack.
It is. We're drawing from journalistic postmortems in The Wire, deep dive historical breakdowns of the Sri Lankan Civil War, archival news reports from NDTV, and thousands of pages of incredibly dense legal documentation from the Jain Commission of Inquiry.
We're basically going to start in the geopolitical paranoia of the Cold War.
Wade through the brutal jungle counterinsurgencies of the 1980s.
Break down the unbelievable biological and analog mechanics of the assassination plot itself.
Which is wild. Yeah. And finally, try to understand the sprawling judicial aftermath. But before we take that first step, though, there is a crucial point we need to make to you, our listener.
Yes, this is really important. The materials we are unpacking today deal with highly sensitive, profoundly politically charged history.
Yeah, you were charged.
We're talking about ethnic conflict, international espionage, militant organizations, and brutal military actions by state forces. Our role here is to strictly and impartially report the information contained within these provided sources.
Right. We are not taking sides.
Not at all. We're not passing moral judgment, and we are certainly not endorsing any political or militant viewpoint. Our sole aim is to lay out the facts, the timelines, and the arguments exactly as they exist in the documents.
So, to understand how we get to that blinding flash of light in Tamil Nadu in 1991, we actually have to cross the puck straight and rewind the clock several decades.
We have to look at the island of Sri Lanka in the years following its independence from British rule in 1948.
Because the bomb that killed Rajiv Gandhi was literally manufactured out of the frustrations of a completely different nation's civil war.
That's the tragic irony at the center of all this. The conflict is deeply rooted in the post-independence policies of the Sri Lankan government in Colombo, which became heavily dominated by the Sinhalese majority.
Right.
Over the course of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the government enacted a series of legislative and social policies that, systematically marginalized the Tamil minority.
And I think it's important to understand the texture of that marginalization.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a vague feeling of being underrepresented in a parliament.
No, not at all.
We're talking about policies that fundamentally altered the day-to-day survival of the Tamil population. The defining piece of legislation here seems to be the Sinhala-Only Act of 1956. So if you're a Tamil civil servant or a doctor or a teacher, What does that act actually do to your life overnight?
It completely upends it. I mean, by making Sinhala the sole official language of the country, the government effectively disenfranchised millions of Tamil speakers. If you were a Tamil civil servant and you couldn't suddenly pass proficiency exams in Sinhala, you lost your job.
Just like that.
Just like that. Your avenues for higher education were drastically restricted by standardization policies. They actually required Tamils to score higher than Sinhalese students just to enter universities.
So the deck was completely stacked against them.
Entirely. It choked off employment opportunities in the state sector, and for decades, Tamil political leaders engaged in peaceful democratic protests trying to achieve equal rights and, a devolution of political power.
But they were consistently ignored.
Ignored, or worse, met with state-sanctioned violence.
And history tells us time and time again, when an entire demographic feels that the avenues for peaceful democratic change are permanently bricked up, frustration inevitably breeds armed militancy.
It always does.
The youth don't wait around for another petition to be ignored.
Exactly. And that transition from political protest to armed struggle really solidifies in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Various Tamil separatist groups began to form in the north and east of the island.
And their demands shifted, right?
Oh, massively. They were no longer asking for equal representation within Sri Lanka. They were demanding the creation of an entirely independent sovereign state called Tamil Eelam.
Right. And out of all these different militant factions operating in the jungles in the northern peninsula, one group eventually absorbs or eliminates its rivals to become the undisputed powerhouse.
The Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam.
The LTTE, led by Velupillai Prabhakaran. But here is the massive geopolitical pivot point. We have an escalating ethnic conflict on an island nation. Why does the Indian government in New Delhi decide to insert itself into a neighboring country's civil war?
Well, you have to view this through the lens of the Cold War map of the early 1980s. At that time, Sri Lanka's president, J.R. Jayewardene, was adopting a distinctly pro-Western foreign policy. This was a massive red flag for the Indian government under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. India has historically leaned toward the non-aligned movement, but during the Cold War, they had a strong strategic tilt toward the Soviet Union.
Right, and India views the Indian Ocean region as its primary sphere of influence, its strategic backyard, basically.
Exactly. So if you are Indira Gandhi looking at intelligence reports in the early 80s, you are seeing the Sri Lankan government bringing in some deeply concerning foreign actors to help put down the Tamil insurgency.
Who are we talking about here?
We're talking about Israeli Shin Bet intelligence operatives.
Wow.
Pakistani commandos training the Sri Lankan army, and South African mercenaries.
That is an incredibly volatile cocktail of foreign intervention right on India's doorstep.
And add to that the negotiations that could have potentially granted the United States Navy refueling and rest and recreation rights at the Trincomalee port.
Trincomalee?
Yeah, Trincomalee is one of the deepest, most strategically valuable natural harbors in the world. It's perfectly suited for submarine operations.
The New Delhi is sweating.
Big time. Plus, Colombo was negotiating deals for Voice of America broadcasting stations, which Indian intelligence suspected could be used for electronic surveillance.
Right, so from New Delhi's perspective, Sri Lanka wasn't just fighting a civil war. It was turning into a hostile beachhead for foreign intelligence and military powers right off India's southern coast.
Precisely. And alongside that massive geopolitical chess match, Indira Gandhi is facing an absolute pressure cooker domestically.
In Tamil Nadu.
Yes, you have 50 million Tamils living in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu. They share deep cultural, linguistic, and ancestral ties with the Tamils in Sri Lanka.
So when things go bad over there, it is felt deeply over here.
Right. When the violence in Sri Lanka reaches a boiling point, specifically the horrific anti-Tamil pogroms of Black July in 1983, tens of thousands of refugees start pouring across the water into India, and they're bringing stories of absolute devastation.
And the domestic outrage in Tamil Nadu had to be deafening.
Oh, it was. The state politicians were deeply sympathetic to the Sri Lankan Tamils and were already providing sanctuary, patronage, and funds to various militant groups. The central government in New Delhi realized they couldn't just sit on their hands.
They had to act.
They had to pacify the political fury in their own country while simultaneously neutralizing the geopolitical threat of Jayewardene's pro-Western leanings.
So the Indian central government authorizes a covert strategy. The intelligence agency, the research and analysis wing, or RAW, steps in, and they begin actively training and arming Tamil militant factions, including the LTTE, right there on Indian soil.
Yes.
They're setting up covert camps, supplying weapons, teaching insurgent tactics. But here is the fundamental contradiction that seems to doom this strategy from day one. India is feeding and arming a militant group whose ultimate non-negotiable goal is to carve out a separate independent country. But the Indian government didn't actually want Sri Lanka to be partitioned, did they?
No, they absolutely didn't. India's official stance, which was communicated through Indira Gandhi's various diplomatic envoys, was always in favor of a unified Sri Lanka.
So why arm separatists?
The covert arming of the LTTE was intended as a mechanism of defensive leverage. India wanted to use the militants as a proxy pressure point to force the Colombo government to kick out the foreign mercenaries back away from the U.S. and devolve just enough political power to the Tamils to stabilize the island.
I see. So India essentially wanted a neighbor that respected its minority population and, crucially, deferred to Indian regional hegemony.
Exactly.
But it's the classic terrifying hubris of covert intelligence. You think you can hold a tiger by the tail.
Just the perfect analogy.
You give highly motivated, ideologically driven fighters modern weaponry and tactical training, assuming you can just, turn off the tap and control them once your geopolitical goals are met.
Right, but you've inadvertently professionalized an army that is fighting an existential war for their own homeland.
Exactly. It is the textbook definition of blowback. You empower a proxy force for short-term leverage, completely underestimating their autonomy.
And when the political winds shift, that proxy force doesn't just put down its guns, it turns those guns on anyone who stands in the way of its ultimate goal.
Which brings us to the mid-1980s. The political winds in India shift violently. Indira Gandhi is assassinated in 1984 in a completely unrelated event.
Right.
And her son, Rajiv Gandhi, takes over as Prime Minister. He inherits this incredibly volatile, covert proxy war on his southern border. And he decides he wants to clean it up. He doesn't want a perpetual insurgency running out of Tamil Nadu.
Right. And Rajiv Gandhi's approach culminates in the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord, which was signed on July 29, 1987 in Colombo. It was signed by Rajiv Gandhi and President Jaywardene.
And on paper, it was designed to be the grand compromise that would end the civil war.
On paper, yes.
So looking at the breakdown of this accord, it seems like it demanded massive concessions from both sides. The Sri Lankan government agrees to amend their constitution, the 13th Amendment, to officially devolve political power to provincial councils.
Huge.
Yeah. They agree to temporarily merge the northern and eastern provinces to create a single administrative zone where Tamils are the majority. And they finally make Tamil an official language alongside Sinhala.
Which is a massive political reversal for Colombo.
Right. So what was the Indian side of the bargain?
Well, in exchange for those political concessions, India agreed to completely shut down the covert insurgency pipeline. They promised to stop all aid to the militants operating from Indian soil.
Okay.
But more significantly, India agreed to deploy its own military, the Indian Peacekeeping Force, or IPKF, into northern Sri Lanka to physically disarm the Tamil militant groups and guarantee the ceasefire.
Wait. So in the span of a few years, the Indian government transitions from secretly giving the Tamil militants assault rifles to openly sending the Indian army across the ocean to take those same rifles back.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. The logical flaw here is staggering. Because when you look at the signatories of this 1987 accord, it's Rajiv Gandhi and J.R. Jaywardene, the two heads of state. The LTTE, the actual people holding the guns and controlling the territory in northern Sri Lanka,
Aren't on the document.
they aren't on the document.
They were entirely excluded from the formal negotiations. Rajiv Gandhi's government essentially presented Vallupillai Prabhakaran with a fait accompli.
Just a done deal.
Right. Prabhakaran was flown to New Delhi, placed under immense pressure by Indian intelligence, and cornered into agreeing to a token, ceremonial handover of a few weapons, but he never bought into the accord.
Why would he?
Exactly. For Prabhakaran, accepting limited provincial administrative power under the Sri Lankan constitution was tantamount to a total betrayal of the dream of Tamil Eelam.
So this accord is basically built on sand. And the illusion that this piece of paper was going to bring peace shattered almost immediately, and in a deeply visceral way. The timeline in the sources points to October 1987 as the moment the point of no return is crossed.
Yes, October 1987. That was the catalyst for the absolute unraveling. The Sri Lankan Navy intercepted a boat off the coast carrying 17 LTTE members, and among them were 12 highly senior commanders.
So they were taken into custody.
Right. Now, according to the amnesty provisions laid out in the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord, those men should have been released.
Because they had a ceasefire.
Exactly. However, the Sri Lankan government insisted on transporting them to Colombo for interrogation. The LTTE leadership immediately contacted the Indian peacekeeping force, demanding that India intervene and protect their commanders.
Because India was the official guarantor of the accord.
Right.
And the IPKF is just stuck in the middle. The commanders on the ground are frantically trying to negotiate a compromise, but the political orders coming down from New Delhi are to stand down and let the Sri Lankan government handle it.
And this leads to a horrifying scene. As the Sri Lankan military is preparing to forcibly board these 12 senior LTTE commanders onto an aircraft bound for Colombo, the commanders realize no help is coming from India. So, simultaneously, all 12 men bite into the cyanide capsules they wear around their necks.
Like 12s.
All 12. They die right there on the tarmac.
It's an incredibly grim, shocking visual. 12 high-ranking guerrilla leaders choosing immediate suicide over submitting to interrogation. I imagine that completely radicalized the rank-and-file LTTE fighters who saw India as failing to protect them.
It absolutely did. It obliterated any microscopic shred of trust that might have still existed. The LTTE immediately launched retaliatory massacres against Sinhalese civilians and initiated attacks on Indian troops.
So the peacekeeping facade evaporated overnight.
Overnight. Within days, the Indian government ordered the IPKF, who, by the way, had originally arrived on the island, to cheers and garlands from the Tamil population to launch Operation Polwan.
What was that?
This was a massive military offensive aimed at forcefully disarming the LTTE and capturing the Jaffna Peninsula.
And the Indian Army was fundamentally unprepared for this reality, right? I mean, they were a conventional military force trained for large-scale border conflicts.
Like fighting Pakistan on the Western Front.
Right. And suddenly, they are thrust into an incredibly brutal, close-quarters, urban and jungle counterinsurgency against a guerrilla force that Indian intelligence had literally helped train.
Yeah, the irony is incredibly dark.
I was reading about one specific disaster early in the campaign, the Jaffna University helidrop in October 1987. From a tactical perspective, it sounds like an absolute nightmare.
The intelligence failures were catastrophic. Indian military intelligence received a tip that Prabhakaran and the LTTE High Command were hiding in a building complex near Jaffna University.
So they wanted to cut off the head of the snake.
Exactly. They planned a daring nighttime surgical strike. The objective was to drop elite paracommandos and seek light infantry from helicopters directly onto a football field near the university.
Capture the leadership and the war in one swift stroke.
That was the plan.
But they were walking into a trap.
Completely. The LTTE's intelligence network, which was highly sophisticated, had intercepted the operational plans. The LTTE knew exactly when and where the helicopters were coming. Wow.
They heavily fortified the perimeter around the landing zone. They mounted heavy machine guns on the surrounding rooftops, planted anti-tank mines. As the Indian helicopters descended into the dark, they flew into a solid wall of tracer fire. That's terrifying. The troops that managed to rope down onto the field were instantly pinned down in a crossfire. A significant number of Indian soldiers were killed, and the entire operation was a devastating failure. And Prabhakaran was never even in the vicinity.
Just to give you a sense of just how disjointed the Indian state apparatus was during this time, the sources note another incident where a raw intelligence agent was operating secretly in Sri Lanka.
Oh, this story is unbelievable.
Right. This agent was trying to establish back-channel diplomatic communications with the LTTE on direct orders from elements in New Delhi. But because of the total breakdown in communication, that Indian intelligence agent was actually caught in an ambush and killed by his own side, the Indian peacekeeping force.
Yeah, the left hand of the government was literally shooting the right hand. It's just chaos. And the chaos on the ground led to immense frustration within the IPKF ranks, and that frustration quickly bled over into how they treated the civilian population.
Well, they were fighting an enemy that blended seamlessly into the local environment. So the Indian military began relying heavily on artillery barrages and helicopter gunships in densely populated urban areas, which naturally resulted in massive civilian casualties.
Which destroys their moral legitimacy overnight.
Entirely. The sources heavily document the severe human rights abuses committed during this period. One of the most horrifying incidents was the Jaffna Teaching Hospital massacre in late October 1987.
What happened there?
After a skirmish near the hospital grounds, Indian troops entered the facility. Over 70 unarmed civilians were killed, including patients in their beds and doctors and nurses who were shot while wearing their medical uniforms.
That is horrific.
It is. Furthermore, there are documented, sworn testimonies of sexual violence and systemic gang rape committed by IPKF personnel against Tamil women. The force that had arrived to protect the Tamil minority had fundamentally become an occupying, oppressive army in their eyes.
I really need to pause here because I'm trying to map out the sheer logistical absurdity of what happens next.
Yeah, it's hard to follow.
It is. According to the backgrounders, by 1989, the Indian army is heavily bogged down fighting the Tamil Tigers. Meanwhile, the Sri Lankan government, who originally fought a war against the Tamil Tigers, starts secretly helping the Tamil Tigers.
Yes.
How does a state government secretly funnel weapons to a guerrilla force they are simultaneously supposed to be at war with?
It is arguably one of the most cynical, bizarre, shifting alliances in modern geopolitical history. It all stems from a change in leadership in Colombo. Ranil Singh Premadasa becomes the new president of Sri Lanka, and Premadasa is staring down his own existential crisis. In the southern Sinhalese-dominated regions of the country, a violent Marxist nationalist uprising has erupted, led by a group called the Janatha Vimukthi Peramuna, or the JVP.
I understand the JVP was a Marxist group, but what triggered them to launch a violent uprising at this specific moment?
Their ideology was a potent mix of Marxism and fierce Sinhalese nationalism. The catalyst for their violent insurrection was the presence of the Indian peacekeeping force. The JVP viewed the Indian military not as peacekeepers, but as an imperialist, foreign occupying army violating Sri Lankan sovereignty.
So they capitalized on the anger in the south.
Exactly. They capitalized on the deep resentment among the Sinhalese public regarding the 1987 accord, which they felt had basically sold out the country to India. They began assassinating government officials and paralyzing the South.
So President Premadasa realizes he is fighting a two-front war. He has the JVP burning down the south, and he has the LTTE and the Indian Army tearing up the north. And his priority is survival in the south.
Precisely. Premadasa knows he needs the Indian Army out of his country immediately to rob the JVP of their primary grievance and quell the Southern Rebellion. But the IPKF isn't leaving. So he makes a breathtakingly dangerous decision. He strikes a covert, unholy alliance with his mortal enemies, the LTTE.
Wow. And what does that actually look like on the ground?
It requires completely off-the-books logistics. The Sri Lankan military, under strict presidential orders, begins coordinating midnight drops.
Midnight drops.
Yeah, they load unlit trucks with heavy weapons, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and actual cash. They drive them deep into the jungles to rendezvous points where LTTE fighters take possession.
That is insane.
The Sri Lankan state was intentionally arming the separatist militants, specifically so those militants could inflict maximum casualties on the Indian army and force a political withdrawal.
It's an astounding level of political cynicism. And tragically, for the Indian soldiers caught in the middle, it worked.
It really did.
The casualties for the IPKF kept mounting. By the end of the intervention, 11,165 Indian soldiers had been killed, and over 3,000 suffered permanent injuries. Back in New Delhi, the political tolerance for this endless quagmire collapsed. Rajiv Gandhi lost the 1989 general election.
He was out.
Right. And the incoming Prime Minister, VP Singh, facing immense domestic opposition and direct public demands from President Premadasa to leave, finally ordered a complete withdrawal. By March 1990, the last of the Indian troops boarded transport ships in Trincomalee and sailed home.
The military intervention was over, but the consequences were permanent. India had failed to disarm the militants, they had alienated the entire Tamil population, they had lost over 1,000 men, and they left behind an LTTE that was not only militarily emboldened, but deeply, viscerally vengeful.
And the LTTE leadership held one man personally responsible for the entire 32-month nightmare.
Rajiv Gandhi.
And that resentment sets the stage for the next phase of our timeline. We are now in late 1990. Rajiv Gandhi is no longer Prime Minister. He is sitting in the opposition, out of power. The Indian Army has fully retreated from Sri Lanka. If the threat is gone, why does the LTTE decide to target him for assassination at this specific moment?
Because the LTTE leadership was obsessively monitoring Indian politics, and they saw a terrifying storm brewing on the horizon.
What were they seeing?
By late 1990, the minority coalition governments in New Delhi, first led by VP Singh and then briefly by Chandrasekhar, were collapsing under their own weight. It became blindingly obvious that early general elections were going to be called for the spring of 1991.
Right.
And every political indicator, every opinion poll suggested that Rajiv Gandhi and his Congress party were poised for a massive comeback.
So Prabhakaran is sitting in a bunker in the jungles of Jaffna, and he sees the architect of Operation Polon rising from his political grave. But did he just assume Rajiv would restart the war, or did he have concrete proof?
Oh, Rajiv gave them concrete proof. In August 1990, Rajiv gave a highly publicized, very blunt interview to the Indian magazine Sunday.
What did he say?
In that interview, he didn't express an ounce of regret about the 1987 peace accord. Instead, he explicitly stated that if he were reelected as prime minister, he would strongly consider redeploying the Indian army back to Sri Lanka to finish the job of completely disarming the LTTE.
You're kidding?
No, he even ensured that this aggressive posture was codified in the official 1991 election manifesto of the Congress Party.
So he put it in writing. He telegraphed his foreign policy intentions to a highly capable guerrilla army that had just spent 3 years surviving a war of attrition against his forces.
For Vallabhbhai Prabhakaran and the LTTE High Command, this was not standard campaign bluster. They viewed Rajiv Gandhi's potential return to power as an absolute existential threat to their survival and their administrative control over northern Sri Lanka.
If Rajiv won the election, they genuinely believed a second, even more brutal iteration of the IPKF would be unleashed upon them.
Without a doubt.
Faced with an existential threat, the LTTE makes a cold, preemptive calculation. They decide to cut the head off the snake before the election even happens. But they do this while running an incredibly sophisticated psychological operation, don't they?
Yes, their strategy was two-pronged. First, they needed to completely demonize Rajiv Gandhi in the eyes of their supporters to justify what they were about to do. They launched a massive propaganda campaign, culminating in a book titled Satanic Force.
Satanic Force?
Yeah, and this literature laid the blame for every atrocity, every rape, and every civilian death committed by the IPKF squarely at Rajiv's feet. They were conditioning their cadres to view him not as a political adversary, but as a literal monster.
While behind the scenes.
While behind the scenes, in absolute highest secrecy, Prabhakaran officially authorized the assassination plot.
But to pull off an assassination of a major political figure, you need them to drop their guard. This is where the narrative shifts away from that cliché idea of a chess match. Because Rajiv Gandhi and Prabhakaran weren't playing the same game.
No, they really weren't.
Rajiv Gandhi was a politician trying to win back the hearts of a democratic electorate. He had to be loud, visible, shaking hands, kissing babies, wading into chaotic crowds. He was a noisy target.
Right.
The LTTE, on the other hand, functioned like an ambush predator. They utilized environmental camouflage, absolute stillness, and deception to lure the target into a trap. And the ultimate deception happened in March 1991.
The sheer ruthlessness of their double game is staggering. To create a false sense of security in New Delhi, the LTTE dispatched an official delegation to India on March 5, 1991, to meet personally with Rajiv Gandhi.
To meet with the man they are planning to kill.
Yes. The accounts of this meeting show that the delegation explicitly assured Rajiv that the LTTE held no personal animosity toward him. They told him there was absolutely no threat to his life from their organization, and they suggested they were eager to reopen a peaceful political dialogue once he was back in power.
They looked him in the eye, assured him he was perfectly safe, and then went right back to assembling the bomb. Let's look at the actual mechanics of this conspiracy, because this is where the sources get into some truly unbelievable details. If you're a militant group hiding in the jungles of another country, how do you manage to construct, fund, and execute the assassination of a former prime minister on Indian soil? Who is actually running this operation?
The architectural design of the plot was restricted to the absolute highest echelon of the LTTE, Vallabhbhai Prabhakaran himself, his intelligence chief, Puttu Aman, and a woman named Akila who commanded the women's intelligence wing.
Okay, so the absolute top tier.
Yes, and they selected a highly experienced, deeply trusted veteran operative named Sivarasan to be the mastermind on the ground.
Sivarasan. For those familiar with the visual history of this event, he is the man famously captured in the photographs wearing the white kurta pajama.
Yes, that's him. Sivarasan's mandate was to covertly cross the Palk Strait into Tamil Nadu, secure safe houses, acquire the local materials needed for the explosive device, and manage the personnel of the sleeper cell. And the most critical personnel decision he made was the selection of the actual assassin. He brought over a 22-year-old woman named Kalavani Rajaratnam, who operated under the aliases Danu and then Moji.
Danu. She was part of a specific unit, correct?
She was a member of the Black Tigers, the LTTE's elite, highly indoctrinated suicide commando wing.
Now, I was going through the background notes on Danu's selection, and there is a phrase used that honestly sounds like a concept from a sci-fi espionage thriller, but it was a biological reality that the LTTE actively weaponized. The concept of genetic camouflage.
Yes, genetic camouflage.
Explain how this worked, because I am still trying to wrap my head around it.
It is a chillingly brilliant, albeit dark, operational detail. Danu wasn't chosen merely for her ideological fanaticism. She was chosen because she belonged to a specific clan, the Rajaratnam Pillai family.
Okay.
The individuals in this lineage frequently exhibited a highly unusual physical trait. The bone structure of their face was such that their straight-on frontal facial profile looked drastically different from their side facial profile.
Wait, really? So if I'm an immigration official or a border guard in 1991, and I have an intelligence bulletin with a standard passport-style front-facing photograph of a known militant suspect.
Right.
If that suspect walks past my checkpoint and turns their head to the side, I might completely fail to recognize them because their biological geometry shifts so dramatically.
Exactly. We have to remember the context of the early 1990s. There were no biometric scanners, no ubiquitous high-definition CCTV, no 3D facial recognition algorithms. Border security relied almost entirely on human intelligence and flat physical photographs.
So the LTTE recognized this genetic camouflage as an immense tactical advantage.
They utilized the natural shape of their operatives' cheekbones and jawlines to slip them undetected past the Indian state security cordons.
It's an incredible realization of how deeply granular their planning was. They are outmaneuvering a regional superpower using ancestral biology.
It's astounding.
And the role of ancestry goes even deeper in the formation of this assassination cell. When you're running a conspiracy in a foreign country, your biggest vulnerability is betrayal. How did they ensure that nobody in the cell would talk to the Indian police?
They mitigated the risk of betrayal by binding the cell together with blood. Absolute operational secrecy is nearly impossible to maintain in a sprawling network, so the LTTE kept it entirely within the family. Danu, the assassin, was not just a soldier. She was Sivar-San's first cousin.
Ah, I see.
Sivar-San's mother was the sister of Danu's father. Furthermore, the designated backup bomber, a woman named Subha, was also deeply woven into Sivar-San's extended family network.
So if Indian intelligence does somehow manage to corner a lower-level member of this cell and tries to flip them into an informant, they aren't just asking that person to sell out a political cause.
No.
They're asking them to sign the death warrant for their own cousins and siblings, which is psychologically near impossible to achieve.
And there is a deeper layer of historical institutional loyalty at play here. Danu's father, A. Rajaratnam, wasn't just a bystander. Back in the 1970s, during the incredibly formative early days of the Tamil militant movement, Rajaratnam had served as a crucial intellectual mentor to a young Velupillai Prabhakaran.
Wow, really?
Yes, he had helped shape the ideology of the LTTE's leader. So when Danu volunteered for the suicide mission, she was honoring a deeply rooted, multi-generational family alliance with Prabhakaran.
That is heavy. So let's talk about the logistics of funding an operation like this. You have a sleeper cell operating in southern India. They need to rent safe houses without raising suspicion. They need to bribe local officials for forged documents. They need to purchase materials, transportation, food.
It adds up quickly.
It requires a significant amount of cash. And for years, there were widespread rumors that massive foreign intelligence agencies or hostile states bankrolled this assassination. What did the investigative sources actually reveal about the money trail?
The eventual investigation thoroughly debunked the theories of massive state sponsorship. The reality was far more localized and, frankly, analog. Sivar-San, despite being a ruthless operative, was also a meticulous accountant.
An accountant?
Yeah, he kept a detailed, handwritten diary of the cell's expenses. When investigators eventually recovered this diary, they discovered that the cell entirely bypassed the formal banking system.
So no wire transfers to track, no offshore accounts to freeze?
None of that. They funded the operation by physically smuggling gold biscuits across the Palk Strait from Jaffna into Tamil Nadu on small fishing boats.
Gold biscuits.
Sivar-San would then sell these gold biscuits on the local black market, raising approximately 1.7 million Indian rupees to fund the conspiracy.
I really want to emphasize the terrifying effectiveness of this asymmetrical warfare. You have the massive bureaucratic apparatus of the Indian intelligence services, presumably looking for digital wire transfers, state-sponsored funding patterns, and conventional communication intercepts.
Right, looking at all the usual places.
And right underneath their radar, an ambush predator is operating using the most analog methods imaginable. Localized boat smuggling, physical chunks of gold, deep-rooted family bloodlines, and literal facial biology. They bypass the modern state using ancient methods.
It was a profound failure of imagination on the part of the security apparatus, and it allowed all of these meticulous, chillingly patient preparations to converge flawlessly on a single night.
Which brings us to the tragic climax of this timeline, May 21, 1991. Walk us through exactly what happened as Rajiv Gandhi's motorcade approached the rally in Sriperumbudur.
Rajiv Gandhi had been engaged in an exhausting breakneck campaign tour across southern India. He arrived in Madras, what is now Chennai, early in the evening. His motorcade then began the drive towards Sriperumbudur, stopping frequently at various roadside rallies and intersections to greet supporters.
Right.
He was running significantly behind schedule, finally arriving at the main rally site at approximately 10:10 p.m.
And as we noted earlier, his political strategy required him to be a loud, visible presence. He was actively instructing his local police escorts to drop the security cordons, allowing throngs of well-wishers to press in close to hand him garlands and shake his hand.
Yes, he was deliberately shedding the aloof, heavily guarded image that he felt had alienated voters in the previous election. But waiting inside that chaotic, surging crowd was the LTTE cell.
They were ready.
Savarasan was positioned near the front, wearing his white kurta pajama, holding a notebook to blend in as a journalist. Danu was wearing a bright orange and green salwar kameez, holding a traditional sandalwood garland, and concealed beneath her clothing was a heavy, blue denim belt containing half a kilogram of RDX explosive, heavily packed with thousands of highly lethal steel pellets.
Let's talk about the bomb itself. Because they didn't use standard dynamite or gunpowder, why was RDX chosen for an assassination in a crowded space?
RDX is a military-grade high explosive. It is defined by its incredibly high brisance. Brisance refers to the shattering capability of an explosive. A lower-grade explosive tends to push or heave things out of the way. RDX violently shatters everything in its immediate radius. By packing the explosive with steel pellets, they essentially created a massive, omnidirectional shotgun blast designed to guarantee the obliteration of the target, regardless of the collateral damage.
And the collateral damage that night was devastating. The sources provide the names of the innocent people standing shoulder to shoulder with the assassin, Latha Kannan and her 10-year-old daughter, Koki Lavani.
The presence of that young girl is one of the most heartbreaking details in the official record. As Rajiv Gandhi slowly made his way toward the main dais, surrounded by the crush of the crowd, little Koki Lavani managed to step forward. She had written a poem for the former Prime Minister, and she sang it to him right there in the lights.
A 10-year-old girl.
Rajiv stopped, listened to her, smiled, and gently patted her on the head in appreciation.
And immediately after that moment of pure innocence, the trap springs.
Thanu stepped forward out of the crowd. A female police constable, trying to maintain some semblance of a perimeter, immediately tried to physically intercept her. But Rajiv Gandhi, true to his campaign style, intervened.
He stopped the constable.
He looked at the constable and said, "Let her come." Those were his final words.
Danu approaches him. She places the sandalwood garland around his neck.
She then bent down, ostensibly performing the traditional Indian gesture of touching an elder's feet as a sign of deep respect. But as she bent low, hidden from the view of his lone personal security officer, Pradeep Gupta, her fingers located the toggle switches wired into the denim belt.
Then.
At precisely 10:20 p.m., she triggered the circuit.
The brisance of the RDX instantly shatters the immediate area. Rajiv Gandhi is killed instantaneously. Danu is obliterated. And the shockwaves of steel pellets immediately kills 14 other people standing right there, including Latha Kannan, 10-year-old Koki Lavani, the female police constable who tried to stop the assassin, and Pradeep Gupta.
It is a scene of absolute, incomprehensible carnage and panic.
Now, from an investigative standpoint, an explosion of that magnitude is designed to destroy evidence. The assassin is dead. The crime scene is chaotic. When the dust finally settles, how does a police force even begin to track the ghost of a conspiracy?
In the initial hours, they had virtually nothing. But the turning point came from an unexpected piece of physical evidence. Among the 15 bystanders killed in the blast was a local freelance photographer named Hari Babu.
Now, Hari Babu wasn't just an innocent bystander, was he? He was a local sympathizer who had been hired by the cell.
Exactly. Sivarasan had hired Haribabu to photograph the assassination. The LTTE often documented their operations for internal propaganda purposes and to provide undeniable proof of success to the leadership back in Jaffna.
Right. They wanted proof it was done.
However, Haribabu either misjudged the blast radius or was simply standing too close to Danu when she detonated the belt. The explosion killed him instantly. But amidst the wreckage, investigators recovered his Shannon camera.
And the camera survived.
Remarkably, the casing had protected the film inside from the heat and the shrapnel.
I would assume that even if the film survived, you'd just get blurry silhouettes or washed-out images from the flash. What did they actually find when they took that roll of film into the darkroom?
When the Special Investigation Team, the SIT, developed that roll of film, they found a pristine, sequential record of the conspiracy's final moments. The very first frame that slowly appeared in the developing chemicals captured the scene just seconds before the detonation.
Oh my God.
It showed Danu clearly in her orange and green dress. It showed Latha and Kokilavani standing nearby, and crucially, hovering just a short distance away in the background. The lens had perfectly captured Sivarasan in his kurta padista, holding his notebook, watching the trap close.
They literally possessed the ghost images of the people responsible. They had faces.
That single photograph became the Rosetta Stone for the entire investigation. The SIT, spearheaded by an incredibly tenacious officer named Dr. Karthikeyan, used those images to launch a massive analog dragnet.
And as the review in The Wire emphasizes, the way the SIT cracked this case was a masterclass in grueling shoe-leather detective work.
We really have to remember the era. There were no cell phone tower dumps to analyze, no DNA databases to cross-reference, and no digital CCTV footage to track vehicles.
So how do you leverage a single photograph into an arrest?
You flood the zone. They published the photographs of Danu and Sivarasan in every major newspaper and broadcast them on television. They established public hotlines. They meticulously followed the physical paper trails.
Like what?
For instance, they found pro-LTTE literature on one of the peripheral suspects, and detectives physically tracked down the specific printing press in Tamil Nadu that manufactured that pamphlet, leading to more arrests.
Wow, just piece by piece.
Exactly. They intercepted encrypted high-frequency radio transmissions bouncing between the sleeper cells in Tamil Nadu and the high command in the Jaffna jungles. Indian cryptographers worked around the clock for weeks to break the LTTE's ciphers, eventually allowing them to read the panicked communications between Sivarasan and Potu Aman as the dragnet tightened.
And piece by piece, this analog methodology starts tearing the network apart. They apprehend Nalini and her husband Murugan, who provided logistical support. They track down Arivu, a local sympathizer whose seemingly minor but absolutely fatal contribution to the plot was purchasing the 9-volt batteries that Danu used to trigger the bomb.
But the primary targets, the mastermind Sivarasan and the backup bomber Subha, realized their faces were everywhere and went deep underground.
They managed to evade the massive police manhunt for nearly 90 days, right?
Yes. The pursuit finally culminated in August 1991. The SIT tracked their movements to a specific house in a neighborhood called Karnanakunte on the outskirts of Bangalore. The house was completely surrounded by heavily armed commandos.
But the Indian state was denied the satisfaction of putting the architects of the plot on the witness stand.
Because they adhered to the cyanide protocol. Before the commandos could breach the reinforced doors of the house, Sivarasan, Subha, and several other trapped operatives swallowed their cyanide capsules. To ensure he couldn't be captured alive and resuscitated, Sivarasan also shot himself in the head. They took the most intimate logistical secrets of the operation to the grave.
With the primary conspirators dead, the intense focus of the public and the media violently shifted onto a massive, lingering question. A question that our provided sources spent a vast amount of time dissecting. How was an assassination of this magnitude allowed to happen?
It's the biggest question.
We are talking about a former prime minister, a man whose own mother, Indira Gandhi, was brutally assassinated by her bodyguards just 7 years prior. How was he permitted to wade into a chaotic, unvetted crowd in the middle of the night with virtually zero elite protection?
And the sources present a deeply debated, somewhat contradictory picture of this security failure.
The debate over accountability is fierce. Let's look at the systemic arguments first. The Wire article explicitly cites the findings of the Verma Commission, pointing specifically to page 40 of that report.
And what did they find?
The commission found that the Elite Special Protection Group, the SPG, which is specifically trained for VIP crowd extraction, was officially withdrawn from Rajiv Gandhi in early 1990 by the VP Singh government because he was no longer a sitting prime minister.
But wasn't there intelligence suggesting his life was in danger?
Absolutely. The Intelligence Bureau had explicitly stated in official reviews that there was a continuing, undiminished threat to his life, particularly given his history in Sri Lanka. Senior Congress leaders, like P. Chidambaram, had written multiple frantic letters to the government warning that stripping his security was a fatal error.
So he was left exposed.
Completely. Nina Gopal, a journalist who was actually riding in the car with Rajiv Gandhi earlier that night, wrote extensively about the terrifying, glaring absence of any elite black hat commandos protecting him. He was relying almost entirely on local beat cops and one personal bodyguard.
So that strongly points the finger at bureaucratic, perhaps even politically motivated, negligence in New Delhi.
Right. But then if you look at the historical summary in the Wikipedia source, it notes that the Verma Commission also concluded something else. It stated that the local police arrangements in Tamil Nadu were, technically speaking, adequate on paper.
Adequate on paper, but not in reality.
Exactly, because those arrangements were constantly being undermined and dismantled by local Congress Party leaders who kept breaking the security cordons to allow supporters near Rajiv.
So the analytical question becomes, was the security stripped away by bureaucratic negligence from the top down, or did the local politicians on the ground sabotage the security they actually had from the bottom up?
If we look at this through the lens of disaster analysis, it seems like a textbook example of the Swiss cheese model.
That's Swiss cheese model.
Yeah, complex disasters rarely happen because of a single failure. They happen when multiple, unrelated layers of defense fail simultaneously. You have a systemic failure at the top. The government removes the highly trained SPG commandos who possess the authority to overrule local politicians and enforce a hard perimeter.
That's a massive hole in the first layer of cheese.
Then you have a localized failure, a chaotic environment, under-equipped local police, and politicians actively dismantling physical barricades to please a VIP who wants to be seen touching the masses. That's the hole in the second layer.
Right.
On a night of May 21st, those holes align perfectly, and the assassin, utilizing her genetic camouflage and a concealed belt, was able to walk right through the gaps.
Decades later, even the organization responsible acknowledged the magnitude of what they had done. In 2011, a man named Kumaran Pathmanathan, who had served as the chief arms procurer and international treasurer for the LTTE, gave an incredibly candid interview.
What did he say?
He formally apologized to India for the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. He described the operation as Prabhakaran's monumental historical tragedy and categorized it as a mistake.
Calling it a mistake feels like a staggering understatement, considering it permanently alienated the Indian state, cutting off the LTTE from their most vital geopolitical lifeline, which ultimately contributed to their total military annihilation in 2009.
It was the beginning of the end for them.
But long before that happened, the Indian legal system was forced to reckon with the perpetrators they did manage to capture alive. This brings us to the final, sprawling chapter of our deep dive, the long shadow of judicial battles and commissions.
The legal aftermath of the Rajiv Gandhi assassination is almost as convoluted as the geopolitical history that preceded it. The surviving conspirators, the logistical facilitators like Nalini, Murugan, and Arivu, were not tried in a standard Indian criminal court.
Where were they trying?
The government invoked a highly controversial, extraordinary piece of legislation called the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, commonly referred to as TADA.
From a civil liberties perspective, what made the TADA courts so incredibly controversial?
It drastically altered standard judicial procedures to heavily favor the prosecution. First, the trial proceedings for the accused were held entirely behind closed doors, in camera, shielded from public and press scrutiny.
Oh, no transparency.
None. Second, and vastly more consequential, TADA altered the rules of evidence. Under standard Indian criminal law, a confession made by a suspect to a police officer is generally inadmissible as evidence in a courtroom, precisely because of the historical, pervasive risk of coercion, torture, or fabricated statements.
Right, to prevent forced confessions.
Exactly. However, under the specific provisions of TADA, a confession made to a police officer of the rank of superintendent or higher was explicitly admissible as evidence of guilt.
That is a fundamental shift in the burden of proof. Because if the police secure a confession behind closed doors, it becomes the foundation of the prosecution's entire case. And the defendants in this trial later vehemently claimed that those confessions were violently extracted under duress.
They did repeatedly claim coercion. However, relying heavily on those very confessions, alongside the massive web of circumstantial evidence built from Karthian's analog dragnet, the designated Tata court in Chennai handed down a truly staggering, unprecedented verdict in 1998.
What was the verdict?
They sentenced 26 of the accused individuals to death by hanging.
26 death sentences for a single conspiracy. But that sweeping verdict didn't survive contact with the higher courts, did it?
No, it did not. When the inevitable appeals reached the Supreme Court of India, the bench dramatically reevaluated the application of Tata and the nature of the evidence. The Supreme Court ended up completely acquitting 19 of those 26 individuals of the specific terror charges, ordering their release.
So it went from 26 to just a few?
Yes. They ultimately upheld the convictions and the capital punishment for only 4 core conspirators: Nalini, her husband Murugan, a man named Santhan, and Paravalan, the young man who had purchased the 9-volt batteries.
Yet history shows that even those 4 individuals never faced the executioner. The intersection of deeply personal tragedy and immense political pressure intervened.
Yes, the most poignant and heavily debated intervention came directly from Sonia Gandhi, Rajiv's widow. In the year 2000, she took the extraordinary step of personally petitioning the President of India to grant executive clemency to Nalini.
Why did she do that?
Her reasoning was entirely humanitarian. Nalini had discovered she was pregnant while in custody and had given birth to a daughter inside the prison. Sonia Gandhi, having lost her own husband to violence, explicitly requested that Nalini's life be spared so that the child would not be rendered an orphan by the state.
Wow, that is incredibly powerful.
It is. Following her plea, the government commuted Nalini's death sentence to life imprisonment.
And as for the remaining 3?
The legal machinery ground to an excruciating halt. Their mercy petitions sat undecided on the desks of various presidents for over a decade. Eventually, the Supreme Court ruled that such unconscionable delays in deciding mercy petitions amounted to cruel and inhuman punishment, automatically commuting their death sentences to life in prison.
And they were eventually released, right?
Yes, finally, in 2022, after the convicts had spent over 30 years in solitary confinement and high-security incarceration, the Supreme Court utilized its extraordinary powers to order the release of all the remaining convicts, citing their prolonged incarceration and good behavior.
So, the Tata criminal trial was focused exclusively on assigning guilt and meting out punishment to the individuals in the physical supply chain of the bomb. But our sources dedicate thousands of words of incredibly dense legal text to something else entirely: the Jain Commission of Inquiry.
Yes.
I want to dive into the legal philosophy here because reading the text from the Indian Kanun source was genuinely fascinating. If the Indian state has already established a Tata court, charged suspects, presented evidence, and secured convictions for the assassination, why did the government simultaneously establish a massive parallel commission of inquiry headed by Justice M.C. Jain?
It seems redundant.
Right. Doesn't running an inquiry at the same time as a trial prejudice the judges? Doesn't it violate the legal principle of double jeopardy?
That is precisely the furious legal argument that the central government's own lawyers made at the time. They petitioned the courts, arguing that the Jain Commission had absolutely no jurisdiction to probe areas of the conspiracy that were already covered by the police charge sheet.
But they lost that argument.
They did. But the source text, Jain Commission of Inquiry versus Unknown, provides a masterful dissection of the fundamental philosophical differences between these two bodies and explains why a democracy requires both.
Break down that philosophical distinction for us. Why aren't they redundant?
Well, it comes down to their ultimate goals and their rules of engagement. A criminal court, like the Tata court, is purely adversarial. You have a prosecutor trying to prove guilt and a defense attorney trying to establish reasonable doubt. The court is tightly bound by incredibly strict technical rules regarding what evidence can be heard.
Right.
Its sole narrow purpose is to determine criminal guilt, and it requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Because the stakes are a person's life or liberty, the tunnel of inquiry is extremely narrow. If there is a shadow of a doubt about a foreign intelligence agency's involvement, but no hard proof, the criminal court must throw it out.
So the criminal court is a microscope focused solely on the trigger pullers. What is it, the commission?
A commission of inquiry is inquisitorial. It does not have a prosecutor or a defendant. Most importantly, a commission cannot sentence anyone to prison. Because it cannot strip away a person's liberty, it is unbound by the strict technical rules of evidence that paralyze a criminal court.
No.
Its mandate is not to assign legal guilt. Its mandate is to discover the broader historical truth for the public record. It can examine hearsay, it can demand intelligence files on geopolitical rumors, it can explore the gray areas of alternative theories that a criminal judge would immediately dismiss. As the legal text beautifully notes, quote, "Truth is not self-evident." The commission acts as the nation's detective to establish the factual history of a traumatic event.
To put it plainly, the criminal court asks, can we legally prove that Nadu detonated the RDX belt? The Commission of Inquiry asks, who globally benefited from the removal of Rajiv Gandhi, which intelligence agencies turned a blind eye, and what was the political environment that allowed the bomb to slip through?
Exactly. The Jain Commission was established to hunt for the broader, invisible web of conspiracy. Were there local political figures who tacitly allowed the LTTE to operate? Did foreign intelligence agencies have advance knowledge of the plot?
Did they find anything?
The commission even spawned a spin-off investigative body, the Multidisciplinary Monitoring Agency, the MDMA. The MDMA was tasked with chasing down incredibly complex leads, investigating the finances of controversial Indian godmen like Chandraswamy, and exploring rumors of foreign royal family financing.
Did the MDMA actually find the smoking gun of a grand global conspiracy?
Yeah.
Did they find the puppet masters pulling Savarson's strings?
According to the archival reports in the NDTV source, no, they did not. The MDMA existed for 24 years. They sent formal letters, rogatory, demanding information from intelligence agencies all over the globe. But in 2022, the government quietly disbanded the agency.
24 years and nothing.
Despite decades of searching, they produced no startling revelations that fundamentally altered the core facts established by Dr. Karthikeyan's original SIT investigation. The LTTE planned it, funded it locally, and executed it flawlessly. The wider geopolitical shadows remained just that, shadows.
Now, more than 30 years later, the legal books are finally closing. The last convicts have walked out of prison, the investigative agencies have been disbanded, and the files are being locked away. But the geopolitical, historical, and psychological echoes of this event remain incredibly loud.
They absolutely do. The reverberations of that night in Sriperumbudur fundamentally and permanently altered how the Indian state approaches its neighboring countries, how aggressively it guards its political leadership, and how deeply it understands the devastating cost of covert intervention.
Let's synthesize the incredible, tragic journey we've mapped out today. We started by examining a massive geopolitical miscalculation. The Indian state, attempting to project regional hegemony and placate domestic politics, intervened in the Sri Lankan civil war.
Right.
That intervention devolved into a bloody, unwinnable quagmire that bred a deeply radicalized, vengeful enemy. That enemy, the LTTE, then utilized a decentralized, intensely analog mechanism, smuggling gold biscuits across the water, leveraging fierce family loyalty, and literally utilizing the biological disguise of genetic camouflage to completely outmaneuver the intelligence apparatus of a billion-person nation.
Operating as an ambush predator.
Exactly. They executed a devastating assassination that altered the destiny of a subcontinent. And that blast triggered a multi-decade legal reckoning that struggled immensely to balance the rigid scales of criminal guilt with a wounded nation's desperate need for the broader historical truth. It is a profound reminder, as The Wire so perfectly articulates in its analysis, of how the cost of complacency can reverberate for a country long after headlines fade.
And it reminds us that history is never a clean X-ray. It is an incredibly messy convergence of human hubris, localized failures, and unpredictable biological realities.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you, our listener, to mull over as we conclude. Think deeply about the profoundly analog nature of the conspiracy we've unpacked today. We are talking about funding an international assassination by physically carrying gold biscuits across a strait in a wooden boat.
It's hard to even imagine today.
We are talking about a plot that was only unraveled because a piece of physical photographic film happened to survive the heat of an explosion. And we are talking about assassins evading national security cordons by using genetic camouflage, relying purely on the ancestral shape of their cheekbones to trick human guards looking at flat photographs.
Yeah.
Now, look at the security environment of the world we live in today. We live in an era of ubiquitous biometric scanning at every border, of sophisticated 3D facial recognition software, of inescapable digital footprints, cell tower data dumps, and algorithmic global financial tracking that can spot a suspicious wire transfer instantly.
It's a completely different world.
I want you to ask yourself, would a plot relying on such purely physical, ancestral elements even be theoretically possible today? Or has the nature of political assassination and the terror that drives it permanently shifted away from the physical world of gold and film and entirely into the invisible digital ether?
That is the exact question that keeps counterterrorism analysts and intelligence directors awake every single night.
We want to sincerely thank you for joining us on this deep dive. As always, keep questioning the history behind the headlines, look for the gray areas in the X-rays, and never stop exploring the why and the how behind the what. We'll see you next time.